Hello everybody, today we're going to talk about adding a bass line to our melody that we have created. So just to review, we talked about the chords in the major scale and how we can harmonize that melody and how we do some harmonic rhythm so the chords are going at a certain steady rate and it doesn't sound all jumpy. Alright, so today we're going to take that harmony, the chords that we created, and we're going to create a bass line with it. So we're going to add a bass part. You'll notice also I changed from piano staff to two actual band instruments. That is what is basically called orchestration. And we'll talk about orchestration a little bit more next week, but it's basically assigning who you want to play what when. All right, so our horn part has the melody. And for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm just doing the first four measures here because I want to show you some things that will be problems and how to fix them and how to add a whole bunch of stuff. So I started off here with our bass line in the tuba, and they're just playing all the root notes of the chords. So C, root of the 1 chord, F, root of the 4 chord, G, root of the 5 chord, and that's it. It's just those 4 notes. And it sounds like this. And that is a very typical bass line. Together, sounds like this. All right, not bad, but you kind of want to honor all the people in the band. They all want interesting parts to play. If you're a good composer, all the parts have interesting things to play. When I go to buy music, that is one of the big things that I'm looking for. Educationally, what can I teach with this? And am I teaching everybody this? Or does the tuba just have bop, 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 bop all the time? Does the horn just have, weird harmony parts? Or does the horn get the melody? Do the lows get the melody? Does everybody have an interesting part to play? That's a really hard thing to do, to give everybody an interesting part to play, but that is the eventual goal. So I changed a couple things. Instead of having the bass line repeat, in the next 4 measures here, I had the bass line change notes for, change pitch, for every note value, because the melody's doing the same thing, right? So this one now sounds like this. A little bit better, a little bit more interesting, and the bass line by itself. Or you can hear that's already a little bit more interesting. The only thing I changed was a couple notes. And I'm going to highlight them right here for you. And I'll show you what I did. Alright, so I only changed 4 notes. And what did I do? Well, basically I took, for 3 of these, the D, and this E right here, I just added a different chord tone. Okay, so we're at a 5 chord right here. We've got a G. A D is also part of that G chord. So I just had it move. It leaped down to a D and then it goes to a C. So it's a little bit smoother. And I just repeated it right here. This one is going up the chord of the 1 chord, and it happens to be ending on a 5, which is the root now of our 5 chord. That's where we want it to end. Okay, so it gives a little bit more motion that helps complement the melody a little bit. This one I changed, and right here we're using a 4 chord, and G is not in the chord of F, A, and C. It's not in F major. So how the heck does this work? Well, it works a little bit better because if you look right here, let's see if I can play this for you. That interval right there is F to E natural. It is a very dissonant sound. It doesn't sound very good. It sounds crunchy. Now you can get away with that in some different places, but not on the second note of your piece. So I changed it. So this is going up from E to F. This is going down from G to F. So we end up on the same note, the root of the 4 chord, and we're just approaching it from 2 different ways. This is called contrary motion. One is going up, one is moving down. Now the only problem with that is if we want this to be a 4 chord right here, well, neither of these 2 notes is in the 4 chord. So we just changed the harmony basically, because our 4 chord is F, A, and C. We've got a G here, we've got an E here, so we can't call that a 4 chord anymore because it doesn't have any of the notes, F, A, or C. So I'll show you how to fix that when we add our next part. So now we're going to add a harmony part, right? You know that the lows often play together. They don't necessarily play the same thing. So if you're going to add a trombone part, and I'm just looking at these 4 measures right here, the first line with 3 instruments on it, you can have the trombone play the tuba part, and that just strengthens the bass line. They're playing in unison, but usually an octave apart. Or you can have the trombone add some of the harmony notes. So for example, we've got a 1 chord, right? We've got the C in both of those voices, but we don't have any of the other chord tones. We can add the E, and now all of a sudden it sounds more like a chord. Here's the thing, if you add a G, that's interval right there is called an open fifth from a C to a G. It's very hollow sounding. Here, I'll play it for you. And the fifth note of the chord does not identify the chord as major or minor. In other words, a C major chord is C, E, and G. A C minor chord is C, E flat, and G. It's 2 different notes there, but the C and the G stay the same. So if you have a C and a G, it's very, very open and hollow sounding, right? And that's kind of nasty. So we want to fill it in, with the third as much as we can. So we go to the 4 chord here, and we'll use the 3rd note of the F chord, which is an A. Here we go to the 5 chord. We'll use the 3rd note of the 5 chord. Here's the problem you run into. Here's the trombone part. Which is a big fat meh. I mean, it's okay, but it's not the most interesting part in the world, right? So let's see if we can move some of these notes around a little bit so the trombone is not just filling in. This is one of the problems you run into as a composer. You're trying to fill in all the notes of the chord, and sometimes the melody line of the individual instrument gets lost. And so then the middle instruments, and this happens to French horns and alto saxes all the time. You end up with just a really, really weird sounding line. And it's really hard to play on your own, not in the context of what the overall piece is with everybody else. Okay, so I changed it here in our second line. And again, I'm not changing the melody at all. So let's add our motion, but we're going to change it to the trombone part. And this does 2 things. First of all, it gets our F back into the bass line. So we still have a 4 chord. Here's the root of the chord. This note is not in the chord. This note is not in the chord. But these guys are moving together in what are called parallel motion. So let me play that for you. As long as you don't do that for too long, it sounds pretty good. Notice it goes for 4 beats. For 4 notes. And then I go to contrary motion. I change a little bit what they're doing. So this gets that 4, the F, back into the bass line, and it repeats here. And we're going from a non-chord tone to a chord tone, a non-chord tone to a chord tone. So it's a passing note there in both voices, but it works because it's parallel and strong. So that first measure sounds pretty strong. And the other one that I wanted to change was this measure right here. So instead of repeating that note, we're kind of fixing it like we did in the bass line before. I'm going. It's still a weird note to end on because it's a B natural in the key of C, but that's the chord, right? That's the 5 chord. It's supposed to go on. Notice also, back here I had the bass line moving, right, all over the place. This is a wrong note, by the way. That should be a G. If I'm going to have both of these notes move, now I can have the tuba part repeat that note here, and it'll sound a little bit stronger. So all together, or here, let's do it this way. The trombone part before sounded like this. And now and I didn't change the melody at all, and I changed the tuba part, the bass line, just a little bit, and put them together. It sounds like this. Now that's totally fine for like a chorale style. Everybody's playing the same rhythm right there. But it can get a little bit boring because you've got 2 measures, pause after a half note, 2 measures, pause after a half note. If you were to do that over and over and over again, it would get very boring. Okay, we need a little bit of variety in there. So I didn't really change any of the notes here. I just changed some of the note values. And you notice now the trombone and tuba are together, but the melody never has the same rhythm as these harmony parts. When the melody does have a dotted quarter note in measures 2 and measures 4, the bass lines don't, and vice versa. Okay, so I didn't change really any of the notes, I just changed the rhythms. And it sounds like, oh, let me highlight this correctly. Sounds like this. And then let me add the melody in there so you can hear what all 3 of them sound like. Okay, so we have our little bit more contrast, a little bit more interest. We still have this problem though of a half note here and then a half note here. Do that over and over again, it gets boring. So we can make it a little bit more interesting, make it sound like we want it to go on. Here's a different contrasting rhythm, and it's syncopated. Again, I didn't change any of the notes. I just changed the rhythms to a syncopated rhythm. And that sounds like this. And so now all of a sudden it has a total different character. You add the melody in. And now you have motion here in the bottom part that wants to keep everything moving. And notice at the end of my first part of the phrase here, the end of my 4-bar phrase, these do not stop. They're not static. They want to move forward. So that helps move the whole piece forward. So there's some different things that you can do for contrast. Now, add some percussion. The general rule is whatever, in middle school band, the general rule is whatever the smallest note value here in the winds, it's twice as small in the snare drum and possibly some of the other percussion parts. So if your smallest note value here is an eighth note, the smallest note value that the snare drum will go to is a 16th. Now that only works to 8ths and 16ths. If the winds have 16ths, the snare drums don't have 30 seconds, because then it just becomes very, very messy. Now the bass drum part is emphasizing the bass line. It's not exactly the same as the bass line, because think about a bass drum. It's very boomy. Even if you muffle it, right, it's still really, really boomy. You get all of these notes in a row. Bum, 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 bum. It's going to be hard to pull off and make it sound clear. What we want the snare drum, bass drum, all these percussion parts to do is to accentuate the melody, to support the melody, while still being clear. It's giving us our articulation. So even if like this whole thing were slurred and this were legato, the snare drum, bass drum would give us our articulation. So let me play for you just the tuba and the bass drum so you can see how those parts work together. And notice, first of all, notice in the recording you can hear the bass booming, right? Also notice here, I ended the bass drum on an eighth note to support the bass line and to support the melody so that we want to move forward into the piece. Okay, now the snare drum part, I added some 16th notes in there to give it a greater sense of motion. The snare drum part all by itself sounds like this. And this is a snare drum part here and a bass drum part that our middle school percussionists will be very, very familiar with. It's some of the rhythms that we've actually been working on in our percussion-specific warm-ups. And again, I reinforced our bass line, our melody wanting to move forward, our music wanting to move forward by putting that eighth note, the very last thing on the and of 4 in the last measure. So as far as the snare drum is concerned, it's ending the phrase right with the melody on beat 3. In fact, I'm going to change this to a quarter note. And that way, the melody ends on beat 3. The snare drum part ends with it on beat 3. And then the snare drum can also support the bass drum part, the bass part on the and of 4. So you put these together. I'm going to play the melody and the snare drum part together so that you can hear how they support each other. And now that I've played that, I kind of liked it better when it was 2 eighth notes. So I'm going to change it back. I liked it better when it was 2 eighth notes. That works, but it's a little bit boring. This eighth note is on the and of 3. This note on the bass is on the and of 3, so it is lining up with something else. I like that sound a little bit better. But again, this is where it comes into your choice as a composer. Okay, so you put all these things together, and it all sounds like this. And obviously, I left it open-ended. There's another 4 measures, right? The consequent phrase, the answering phrase that I didn't do here. So, just to review here, let me go back to our harmony. This is where we started. And then we added a harmonic rhythm. And then we changed this, we orchestrated it to have actual band instruments, and we added a bass line. We fixed the bass line to get rid of some of the problems with it. We added another low voice, trying to make everybody's part feel somewhat melodic and interesting. We added an interesting contrasting rhythm to move everything forward. And finally, we added our percussion parts to complement and reinforce the melody and bass line parts. So you can hear how much the character now has changed from when we just had a piano playing chords in one hand and then the melody in the other hand. We've orchestrated it a little bit, we've changed some rhythms around, we've added some interesting parts for everybody, and now it's a completely different piece, really. The only thing that's recognizable is our melody. Okay, so you can do that same thing. If you wrote your 4 measures, or sorry, your 8 measure phrase, or you wrote 2 8 measure phrases, you got 2 different 8 measure phrases to experiment with. You can do different things with different sections of all those and see how you like them. So have fun with that, and we'll talk more about orchestration next time.